Imagine praying for 20 years in a church without knowing that beneath your feet, buried under the altar where you seek divine peace, two women agonized, chained in absolute darkness. In 1990, Sister Maria Teresa and Rebecca disappeared in Segovia. The authorities closed the case. The community forgot them. But the devil wore a cassock and celebrated Mass every Sunday over the tomb of his victims. When in 2010 workers demolished the altar to renovate it, they found something that no prayer could purify. Two chained skeletons, surrounded by human waste, accumulated for years. Horror had lived in silence under sacred ground for 2 decades. But this nightmare story has an ending that no one expected. Sometimes, when God doesn't act, the siblings of victims become avenging angels. Make sure to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss more cases like this, and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. The cold of the Castilian autumn seeped through the centuries-old stones of St. Michael's Church when Sister Maria Teresa Vasquez, 52 years old, finished organizing the sacred chalices after Sunday Mass. The religious woman, known for her unwavering dedication to the community, had devoted the last 20 years of her life to serving God in that small parish on the outskirts of Segovia. Her face, marked by kindness and experience, reflected the peace found only by those who have given their lives to others. Beside her, Rebecca Morales, a girl of barely 14 years, silently swept the corridors of the main nave. Orphaned since age 8, she had found in the church not only refuge but a second family. Sister Maria Teresa had become her protector, her spiritual guide, and the only maternal figure she knew. The girl, with brown hair and bright green eyes, had grown up among the wooden pews and colored stained glass that projected rainbows onto the stone floor. Father Arturo Mendoza, 57 years old, watched from the main altar with an intensity that was disturbing. He had arrived at the parish just 6 months before, transferred from a northern diocese after what ecclesiastical authorities described as adaptation problems. His erratic behavior and episodes of anger had begun to worry the parishioners, who noticed something unsettling in his gaze and in his increasingly dark sermons. That evening, as the bells announced the end of the day, Sister Maria Teresa decided to stay to complete the cleaning of the altar. Rebecca, faithful to her routine, offered to help her. Neither of them imagined that these would be the last hours of freedom they would know. The church sank into sepulchral silence, broken only by the echo of their steps on the cold stone. At 7:30 p.m., when the sun hid behind the mountains, the church lights went out. The neighborhood residents, accustomed to seeing the nun and the girl return to their rooms in the adjoining convent, noticed nothing strange. It was a night like any other in that quiet community, where violent crimes were foreign to daily reality. The last person who saw them alive was Carmen Herrera, an elderly woman who tended the church garden. She would remember years later having seen Father Arturo talking with them near the altar, but at that moment she gave it no importance. It was part of the daily routine, or at least it seemed so. No one could imagine that behind that apparently normal conversation lay the beginning of one of the darkest tragedies the region had ever known. Monday's dawn brought with it the first sign that something terrible had happened. Sister Carmen Ruiz, the convent's Mother Superior, woke at 5:30 in the morning to lead morning prayers and discovered that neither Sister Maria Teresa nor Rebecca had slept in their rooms. The beds remained intact, with no signs of having been used during the night. Initial concern quickly transformed into alarm when searches around the convent and church yielded no results. Father Arturo, who was supposed to celebrate the 7 a.m. Mass, appeared notably nervous and sweaty. When Sister Carmen asked him if he had seen the missing women, the priest responded evasively, claiming he had seen them leave the previous evening after completing their tasks. At 10 a.m., the Civil Guard of Segovia received the first formal complaint. Sergeant Miguel Castellanos, a 45-year-old veteran with more than 20 years of service, took charge of the initial investigation. His experience told him that disappearance cases in religious communities usually resolved within hours, generally with simple explanations: uncommunicated family visits, medical emergencies, or administrative misunderstandings. However, this case presented unusual characteristics from the beginning. Sister Maria Teresa was known for her extreme punctuality and responsibility. She had never failed in her duties without prior notice, much less would she have put Rebecca at risk, whom she protected like a daughter. The girl, for her part, had no known family who could have claimed her unexpectedly. The initial investigation focused on the church surroundings. Agents combed the cemetery, gardens, and adjacent buildings, searching for any clue that could explain the whereabouts of the missing women. They questioned neighborhood residents, but no one had seen or heard anything unusual during Sunday night. Father Arturo was interrogated as a witness, not as a suspect. His condition as a priest granted him a presumption of innocence that would prove fatal for the investigation. When the civil guards asked him about the last moments he had spent with the missing women, the religious man maintained his version. He had seen them finish their tasks and head toward the convent around 7 p.m. The investigators noticed some strange behaviors in Father Arturo: trembling hands, excessive sweating, and a tendency to avoid direct eye contact. However, these symptoms were attributed to the natural stress of the situation and the known mental health problems that had motivated his transfer to the parish. The first 2 weeks of investigation were characterized by an exhaustive but fruitless search. The Civil Guard deployed all available resources: canine units, civilian volunteers, and even a helicopter from the Getafe military base. They combed forests, searched abandoned houses, dredged the Eresma River, and checked every cave and shelter within a 50-kilometer radius around Segovia. The region's religious community mobilized extraordinarily. Convents, parishes, and Catholic organizations throughout Castile and León joined the search. Prayer chains were organized, and thousands of posters with photographs of Sister Maria Teresa and Rebecca were distributed throughout Spain. The national press began following the case, transforming the disappearance into an event of media relevance. Father Arturo, far from staying on the sidelines, showed himself as one of the most active collaborators in the search. He organized special masses, led prayer groups, and personally participated in countryside searches. His apparent dedication and concern for the missing women reassured investigators, who began considering other lines of investigation. One of the most developed hypotheses was that of a possible religious sect. In those years, Spain had experienced several cases of sectarian groups that captured vulnerable people, especially women and minors. Investigators tracked all non-Catholic religious organizations in the region, but found no connections with the missing women. The possibility of a crime of passion or economic motive was also investigated. The convent's finances were reviewed, searching for possible motives related to money or properties. All men who had contact with the victims in the months prior to the disappearance were questioned, including merchants, maintenance workers, and regular parishioners. The lack of physical evidence proved to be the main obstacle for the investigation. No traces of blood, clothing, personal objects, or any evidence that could indicate where they were last seen were found. It was as if they had disappeared without a trace, evaporating into thin air after that Sunday Mass. Sergeant Castellanos began to suspect he was facing a very different case from the usual ones. The total absence of clues suggested careful planning or detailed knowledge of the area. Someone had managed to make 2 people disappear without leaving absolutely any evidence, which required not only premeditation, but also privileged access to information about their routines and movements. As weeks passed without significant progress, the intensity of the investigation began to diminish. Police resources, limited and needed for other cases, were gradually reassigned. Sergeant Castellanos, who had developed a personal obsession with the case, continued working on it during his free time, but without the institutional support necessary for an effective investigation. Media pressure also faded over time. National newspapers stopped publishing updates on the case, and posters with photographs of the missing women were removed or covered by new information. Spanish society, faced with other problems and tragedies, slowly began to forget Sister Maria Teresa and Rebecca. In St. Michael's Church, life continued with apparent normalcy. Father Arturo definitively established himself as the titular parish priest, gradually earning the trust of the parishioners. His behavior stabilized notably after the first weeks following the disappearance, which was interpreted as a sign that he had overcome the initial trauma of the incident. However, some community members began to notice subtle but disturbing changes in the priest's behavior. He had become more withdrawn, spent long hours in the church during nights, and had developed a particular obsession with keeping certain areas of the temple closed. When parishioners asked why some sectors were restricted, Father Arturo cited maintenance or security reasons. The convent's Mother Superior, Sister Carmen Ruiz, maintained her suspicions about Father Arturo for a long time. She had noticed inconsistencies in his testimony and behaviors that didn't fit the image of a priest concerned about his parishioners' welfare. However, her concerns were dismissed by ecclesiastical authorities who considered it unthinkable that a priest could be involved in such a serious crime. In December 1992, exactly 2 years after the disappearance, the case was officially archived for lack of evidence. The file, which had grown to include more than 1,000 pages of testimonies, reports, and photographs, was stored in Civil Guard archives with the classification of cold case. The victims' families in Rebecca's case, practically non-existent, lacked resources to keep the investigation alive. The case's archival marked the end of an era of hope for those who believed the truth would come to light. The religious community organized a commemorative mass for the souls of the missing women, ironically officiated by Father Arturo himself, who delivered a moving sermon about the importance of keeping alive the memory of the absent. During the following 2 decades, silence took hold of Sister Maria Teresa and Rebecca's case. St. Michael's Church continued functioning normally under Father Arturo's direction, who had managed to consolidate his position in the community. His behavior had stabilized completely, and many parishioners considered him an exemplary priest, dedicated and committed to his pastoral work. However, behind this facade of normalcy, a silent tragedy of unimaginable proportions was developing. In the church's basements, hidden under the main altar, there existed a space that had been modified and adapted for a sinister purpose. What was once a medieval crypt had been transformed into an underground prison where the victims remained captive. During these years, Father Arturo developed a meticulous routine to keep his crime secret. Every night, after the last parishioner left the church, he descended to the basement to bring food and water to his prisoners. He had chained them so they couldn't escape, but could move enough to stay alive. The entrance to the basement was hidden under a stone slab that only he knew, perfectly camouflaged with the rest of the church floor. The local religious community experienced several significant changes during these years. Many of the nuns who had known Sister Maria Teresa were transferred to other convents or died of natural causes. The memory of the missing women gradually faded, maintained only by a few people who had been especially close to the victims. One of these people was Elena Morales, Rebecca's older sister, who had been working in France as a nurse during the years of the disappearance. Elena had returned to Spain in 1995, 5 years after the tragedy, and had been devastated to learn of her younger sister's disappearance. Despite the years that had passed, she had never lost hope of finding answers. Elena, now a 35-year-old woman, had developed a personal obsession with her sister's case. She had preserved all newspaper clippings, had maintained correspondence with Sergeant Castellanos, now retired, and had regularly visited Segovia to keep Rebecca's memory alive. Her intuition told her there was something that didn't fit in the official version of events. During these years, Elena had noticed some disturbing details about Father Arturo. In her visits to the church, she had observed that the priest appeared nervous when she appeared, and that he tended to change the subject when the missing women were mentioned. She had also noticed that certain areas of the church remained consistently closed to the public, without convincing explanations. Fate intervened unexpectedly when the Diocese of Segovia approved a comprehensive renovation project for St. Michael's Church. The work, financed by an anonymous donation from a Catholic benefactor, included complete restoration of the main altar, installation of new lighting and heating systems, and modernization of the temple's electrical installations. Father Arturo, now 77 years old, showed initial opposition to the renovation project. He cited economic reasons and concerns about preserving the church's historical character. However, pressure from the diocese and parishioners, who viewed the temple's modernization favorably, forced him to accept the work. The construction company in charge of the renovation, Vega Brothers Construction, began work on March 15, 2010. The project was directed by architect Antonio Vega, a meticulous 52-year-old man specialized in historic building restoration. His team included archaeologists and heritage specialists, since any findings of historical value had to be preserved and documented. During the first week of work, while preparing the main altar area for new system installation, workers noticed that the floor presented unusual irregularities. Some stone slabs seemed to have been removed and replaced in the past, creating small unevenness that didn't correspond to the temple's original construction. Antonio Vega decided to conduct a more detailed study of the area before continuing with the work. Using ground-penetrating radar, his team discovered the existence of a considerable underground cavity beneath the main altar. The church's original plans, dated to the 16th century, showed no existence of this cavity, suggesting it had been excavated or modified later. On March 22nd, workers began carefully removing floor slabs to access the underground cavity. Father Arturo, who had obsessively supervised the work during the first week, suddenly disappeared that morning, claiming health problems requiring immediate medical attention. When they finally managed to access the underground space, workers found themselves facing a scene that would mark them for the rest of their lives. The basement, illuminated by their flashlights, revealed a space that had clearly been inhabited. There were dirty mattresses, containers for food and water, and a considerable amount of waste accumulated over years. But the most shocking thing was at the back of the basement. Two human skeletons chained by their ankles to the stone wall, surrounded by clothing remains that time had reduced to tatters. The remains, by their size and characteristics, clearly corresponded to an adult woman and an adolescent. The discovery in St. Michael's Church basement shocked all of Spain. Antonio Vega, the architect in charge of the renovation, was in a state of shock when he immediately called the civil guard. The scene he had found exceeded any nightmare he could have imagined. Two chained human skeletons, surrounded by evidence of prolonged captivity. Captain Maria José Ruiz, 42 years old, took charge of the investigation. A civil guard veteran with specialization in violent crimes, she had worked on some of the region's most complex cases during the last 15 years. Her experience allowed her to immediately recognize that she was facing a case of kidnapping and murder of extraordinary gravity. The first forensic analyses, conducted by Dr. Carlos Mendoza's team, revealed chilling details about the conditions in which the victims had lived and died. The skeletons showed signs of severe malnutrition, multiple fractures in different stages of healing, and evidence of repeated trauma. The chains that had kept them prisoner were long enough to allow limited movement but not to escape. Analysis of clothing remains and objects found in the basement confirmed what many already suspected. These were Sister Maria Teresa Vázquez and Rebecca Morales, the two women who had disappeared 20 years earlier. A silver crucifix that had belonged to the nun and a small medallion with a photo of Rebecca's parents definitively confirmed their identities. The forensic investigation also revealed that the victims had survived in captivity for a prolonged period, possibly several years. Carbon-14 analyses and other scientific tests suggested they had died between 1995 and 1997, meaning they had remained prisoners for approximately 5 to 7 years before dying. The basement's condition provided additional evidence about the captivity conditions. Food remains, water containers, and a considerable amount of human waste that had accumulated over years were found. Everything indicated that their captors had deliberately kept them alive, providing them with the minimum necessary to survive. News of the discovery spread rapidly throughout Spain. National media outlets sent teams to Segovia to cover what was already becoming one of the most shocking criminal cases in the country's recent history. Images of the basement, carefully censored to protect the victim's dignity, caused commotion in public opinion. The immediate search for Father Arturo Mendoza became a national priority. An arrest warrant was issued, and police resources from all over Spain were mobilized to locate him. However, the priest seemed to have completely disappeared, as if he had anticipated the discovery and prepared to flee. The investigation also extended to ecclesiastical authorities. The Diocese of Segovia was placed under scrutiny to determine if it had prior knowledge of Father Arturo's mental problems or if it had covered up evidence of criminal behavior. The priest's background, including his transfer from the northern diocese, was thoroughly examined. The search for Father Arturo Mendoza became a national manhunt that captured all of Spain's attention. Police authorities mobilized extraordinary resources to locate the priest, who had disappeared without a trace the same day the remains were discovered in the church basement. Investigation into Father Arturo's background revealed a disturbing history that had been systematically hidden by ecclesiastical authorities. His transfer from the Diocese of Oviedo in 1990 had not been motivated by adaptation problems, as officially reported, but by accusations of inappropriate behavior with minors that were never adequately investigated. The investigative team, led by Captain Ruiz, discovered that Father Arturo had been the subject of at least 3 formal complaints in his previous parish. The accusations, filed by community families, alleged strange behaviors and inappropriate approaches toward children and adolescents. However, ecclesiastical authorities had opted to transfer him silently instead of investigating the complaints. Post-mortem psychological analyses, based on testimonies from people who had known Father Arturo, revealed the profile of an individual with serious mental disorders. Specialists identified signs of psychopathy, narcissistic personality disorders, and possible psychotic tendencies that had been ignored or minimized for years. Elena Morales, Rebecca's sister, became a central figure in the investigation. Her testimony about the suspicions she had maintained for years about Father Arturo provided valuable clues for investigators. Elena had meticulously documented each of her visits to the church, recording the priest's strange behaviors and inconsistencies in his statements. The investigation also revealed that Father Arturo had physically modified the church basement during the first months after his arrival at the parish. He had hired workers from outside the region, paying them in cash and swearing them to secrecy about the security improvements he was making in the temple. These workers, located 20 years later, confirmed they had installed chains and reinforced the basement walls. On April 15, 2010, almost a month after the discovery, a shepherd found Father Arturo's body in a wooded area about 50 kilometers from Segovia. The corpse showed signs of extreme violence, multiple stab wounds, skull fractures, and evidence of torture before death. The crime's brutality suggested it had been executed by someone with a deep desire for revenge. Forensic analysis of Father Arturo's body revealed he had been murdered approximately 2 weeks before being found, which coincided with the days following the basement discovery. The wounds, according to experts, had been inflicted with fury and precision, suggesting the killer had medical or anatomical knowledge. The investigation into Father Arturo's murder became a parallel case that further complicated the situation. Investigators now faced a double mystery: the kidnapping and murder of the 2 women 20 years earlier, and the brutal assassination of the perpetrator under circumstances that seemed to indicate personal justice. The investigation into Father Arturo Mendoza's murder took an unexpected turn when forensic analyses revealed crucial evidence about his killer's identity. Under the priest's fingernails, skin and blood remains that didn't belong to him were found, and DNA samples obtained were compared with police databases. Captain Ruiz discovered that the DNA matched that of Elena Morales, Rebecca's sister, who had been interviewed multiple times as a witness during the original case investigation. Elena had voluntarily provided DNA samples to help identify her sister's remains, not knowing these samples would incriminate her in Father Arturo's murder. When Elena was arrested on April 20, 2010, her reaction was one of relief rather than denial. During interrogation, she immediately confessed her participation in Father Arturo's murder, providing details that only the killer could know. Her account revealed meticulous planning motivated by 20 years of pain and thirst for justice. Elena explained that she had suspected Father Arturo from the moment she returned to Spain in 1995. Her regular visits to the church had not been only to keep her sister's memory alive, but to observe and gather evidence against the priest. She had noticed inconsistencies in his behavior, lies in his statements, and particular nervousness whenever the missing women's case was mentioned. For years, Elena had developed a plan to obtain justice on her own. She had studied Father Arturo's schedules and routines, learned about church access points, and acquired knowledge about human anatomy by leveraging her profession as a nurse. Her goal was to force the priest to confess his crimes before taking justice into her own hands. On March 23, 2010, one day after the basement discovery, Elena had followed Father Arturo when he left the church. She had confronted him in an isolated wooded area where she had forced him to confess all the details of his crimes. The priest, according to her testimony, had admitted not only the kidnapping, but also years of abuse and torture against the victims. Elena described how she had used her medical knowledge to inflict on Father Arturo suffering proportional to what he had caused her sister and Sister Maria Teresa. She had deliberately prolonged his agony, ensuring he experienced the terror and pain his victims had suffered for years in captivity. Elena's confession generated a national debate about justice, revenge, and the limits of the legal system. Many citizens expressed understanding and even support for her actions, considering she had done justice where the system had failed. However, others argued that no one had the right to take justice into their own hands, regardless of circumstances. Elena Morales' case became a symbol of the struggle between legal justice and moral justice. Her defense attorney, renowned criminal lawyer Miguel Torrente, argued that her actions had been motivated by post-traumatic stress disorder caused by 20 years of pain and uncertainty about her sister's fate. Elena Morales' trial became one of the most followed judicial proceedings in Spain's recent history. The case raised fundamental questions about the nature of justice, institutional responsibility, and the limits of forgiveness. Media outlets followed every detail of the process, while public opinion divided between those who considered Elena a heroine and those who saw her as a murderer. The prosecution, led by Chief Prosecutor Antonio Serrano, requested a 25-year prison sentence for premeditated murder. Their arguments centered on the fact that, regardless of circumstances, no citizen had the right to execute justice with their own hands. The rule of law, they argued, must be maintained even in the most extreme cases. The defense, led by Miguel Torrente, presented a case based on extraordinary mitigating circumstances. They argued that Elena had suffered severe psychological trauma that had affected her judgment capacity, and that her actions, while legally condemnable, were understandable from a human perspective. They presented testimonies from forensic psychology experts who confirmed Elena's state of mental alteration during the years following her sister's disappearance. The trial's most shocking testimony was Elena's own. For 3 days, she recounted in detail the 20 years of suffering she had experienced, the frustration with a system that had failed to protect her sister, and the desperation that had led her to take justice into her own hands. Her testimony, charged with emotion but also with implacable logic, moved everyone present in the courtroom. The tribunal, presided over by Magistrate Carmen Vasquez, faced an extraordinarily complex decision. On one hand, it had to maintain the principle that no one is above the law. On the other, the case's circumstances presented nuances rarely seen in the judicial system. Father Arturo's death had been brutal, but it had also provided the closure that the legal system had been unable to offer for 2 decades. On September 15, 2010, the tribunal issued its verdict. Elena Morales was found guilty of murder, but with extraordinary mitigating circumstances. The sentence was 12 years in prison, significantly less than the prosecution's request, implicitly recognizing the case's exceptional circumstances. The sentence generated mixed reactions in Spanish society. Human rights organizations applauded the recognition of mitigating circumstances, while some conservative sectors criticized what they considered too lenient a sentence for premeditated murder. The Catholic Church, for its part, publicly asked for forgiveness for the institutional failures that had allowed the tragedy to occur. Subsequent investigation revealed systematic failures in handling the original case. Sergeant Castellanos, now retired, publicly admitted that suspicions about Father Arturo had been dismissed too quickly due to his condition as a priest. Ecclesiastical authorities acknowledged their responsibility in transferring Father Arturo without adequately investigating previous accusations. The remains of Sister Maria Teresa Vasquez and Rebecca Morales were buried with honors in a ceremony that brought together thousands of people from all over Spain. St. Michael's Church was deconsecrated and subsequently converted into a memorial center dedicated to victims of institutional abuse. A commemorative plaque at the entrance remembers the 2 women and honors their memory. Elena Morales served 8 years of her sentence before being released for good behavior in 2018. During her time in prison, she became an advocate for victims' rights and worked with organizations dedicated to preventing similar abuses. Her case inspired legislative changes that improved investigation protocols in disappearance cases and strengthened control mechanisms over religious institutions. The case's legacy transcends individual tragedy to become a symbol of the struggle for justice and institutional responsibility. The story of Sister Maria Teresa, Rebecca, Elena, and Father Arturo remains as a somber reminder of the consequences of systemic failures and the importance of not allowing institutional power to become a barrier to justice. Today, more than a decade after the events, the case continues to be studied in law schools, police training seminars, and child protection programs. The Segovia tragedy has become a paradigmatic case that illustrates both system failures and the imperative need for reforms that protect society's most vulnerable. The memory of Sister Maria Teresa Vasquez and Rebecca Morales lives not only in the commemorative stone of what was once St. Michael's Church, but in every improved protocol, every more rigorous investigation, and every preventive measure implemented so that similar tragedies never repeat in the future. If you've made it this far and want to see more stories like this, I invite you to subscribe to the channel and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any stories. Leave a like so we can keep sharing more stories like this. See you next time.